All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on the Gospel of John. In this recording, we're going to begin looking at John chapter 7, 1 through 52. It's all one story, but we're going to take it in two parts because it's quite a bit of material. So in this session, we're going to go down through John chapter 7, verse 30. And as we turn the page from John chapter 6 to John chapter 7, we've jumped ahead about 6 months in the calendar year of Jesus' life. In John chapter 6, Jesus gave the well-known bread of life speech, and the response of that was such that many people who had been following him for a while now decided no longer to follow him. It was that offensive to them. But the 12, at least the majority of them, have reaffirmed their faith and faithfulness to him. And yet, Jesus warns them that even one of them is going to betray Jesus and really won't persist in faith. That was chapter 6. And even though there's this mixed reaction to Jesus there, the heart of it is Jesus's assurance that he is the true source of life. He is the bread of life, the true sustenance for real life. And the same theme really shows up here in chapter 7. Different feast, different context, different imagery, but it's all about being able to satisfy people's souls and give real lasting life. And this is in keeping with the theme that John said he was going to highlight way back in the prologue to the gospel in John chapter 1, when he said about the Word, about Jesus, that in him was light, and that light was the life of men. Well, we're getting an emphasis on that theme of Jesus being life for mankind. And so he's the bread of life in chapter 6. Here in chapter 7, he's going to offer the water of life. And as we read down through this story, I just need to encourage you to pay attention to how true to life this story is with all the mixed reactions to Jesus. Like, you got to put yourself in the scene. If you're making a movie of this scene, this is very true to life. People are wrestling with who he is. They're wrestling with his identity. They have questions. They like some things about him, but not other things. There's some that are just opposed to him, right? And so you get this wide array of mixed reactions to Jesus in this story, and that's very true to life. So let's jump in to John chapter 7, verse 1, and it gives a little transition and summary statement as John moves to the next snapshot. It says this: After these things, Jesus was walking in Galilee, for he was unwilling to walk in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. When it says after these things refers to the snapshot in John chapter 6. And that snapshot, the bread of life and the feeding of the 5,000, all of that, that was around Passover season. So it was about a year before the final Passover where Jesus is going to be executed. And this verse here of chapter 7, verse 1, summarizes that for a long period of time, Jesus is doing ministry in Galilee, didn't go up to Judea or to Jerusalem. And part of the reason for that was he knew how deep the hostility ran in Judea, and they were seeking to kill him. So he was trying to stay on the down low, stay out of Judea for a while, and he's doing ministry in Galilee. And that fact that he's from Galilee and doing ministry in Galilee is actually very important to what happens in this story, because when he does go to Jerusalem, the Jewish leaders are actually going to use that fact that he's from Galilee against him. Surely he can't be anyone important, they say, in essence, since he's not from Jerusalem. So Jesus is doing ministry in Galilee. He's been doing it there for a while. He's been reluctant to go up to Jerusalem and Judea because of the hostility towards him. And then verse 2, further set up to set the scene for what happens here. Now, the feast of the Jews, the Feast of Booths, was near. So the Feast of Booths is the last major feast and festival of the Jewish calendar year. And this feast actually celebrated and commemorated the time when Israel lived in tents and temporary shelters during their wilderness wanderings in the days of the Exodus. That's why it's the Feast of Booths or tabernacles or tents. And people would build temporary little shelters and they would camp out and live in those shelters. And it was a grand celebration in the fall of the year. So celebrating the Exodus, but also celebrating kind of the harvest season coming to an end. And it was just a grand, glorious kind of capstone to the Jewish liturgical year. And it occurred, as I noted, in the fall. 6 months after the Passover. So when we come to chapter 7, we fast forwarded ahead in Jesus' life 6 months from the previous chapter. And this feast was formerly a 7-day festival. But by the first century, it actually had a bonus day added onto it, a climactic 8th day of celebration and joyful, worshipful assembly. And so, as this feast is approaching, here's what happens in verse 3. So his brothers, that is Jesus's brothers, said to him, "Move on from here and go into Judea so that your disciples also may see your works, which you are doing." In other words, his brothers come to him and they're trying to encourage him to go up to Jerusalem. It's been a while since you've been there. It's been like 6 months, Jesus, and you're here just in these small towns in the backwaters of Galilee. Go up to Jerusalem. Move on from here so that your disciples can see your works, which you are doing. Go to the big city. Go to where people really are. Go to the places that matter, Jesus. For no one, verse 4, does anything in secret when he himself is striving to be known publicly. If you're doing these things, show yourself to the world. And so you hear in his brothers this sort of, they kind of doubt him. They don't like the way he's carrying out ministry. The way he's acting doesn't make sense. Why are you up here in Galilee? Why aren't you down in Judea where all the action really is? And that's important. Judea was the centerpiece for the Jews. Jerusalem was the main stage. And so if you want to be on the main stage, Jesus, if you really are who you're saying you are, you should be in Jerusalem. You should be in Judea. You shouldn't be out here in the backwaters, kind of on the down low in secret. You should be down there where all the action really is. And then John adds this note for us in verse 5. For not even his brothers believed in him. They don't really believe that he's the Messiah. They don't really have confidence in him. Not even his brothers believed in him. How does Jesus respond to their encouragement, their urging for him to go to Jerusalem? We'll look at verse 6. So Jesus said to them, "My time is not here yet." We've seen this theme already, and we're going to see it consistently through the Gospel of John. My time, or sometimes my hour, has not come. Jesus knows that he's got a little more work to do, and it's not time for him to hand himself over to the Jewish leaders and him to be executed. There's more disciple-making work to be done yet. My time's not here yet, but your time is always ready. You can go anytime. It's not my time to go, it's your time to go. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it, that its deeds are evil. So you can go to Jerusalem. There's no threat on your life. There's no fear for you. There's no risk to you. You go. The world doesn't hate you, can't hate you. Hates me, Jesus says, because I actually testify about it, that its deeds are evil. So go up to the feast yourself, verse 8. I'm not going up to this feast because my time has not fully arrived. And so Jesus is telling him, I'm staying in Galilee. I have good reasons for doing it. It's not time for me to do that yet. Now, having said these things to them, he stayed in Galilee. And so they leave, they go up to the feast. Jesus stays behind, at least for a little while. But look at verse 10. But when his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he himself also went up, not publicly, but as though in secret. So he waits for a little while. He doesn't go with the main crowd of pilgrims traveling to the feast. He doesn't go with his whole family. He doesn't even go kind of out in public. He goes on the down low, secretly, as in secret. So the feast is getting underway. Jesus is coming up later. He's coming up sort of on the sly, a little sneakily, on the down low. And here's what's going on in Jerusalem around the time of the feast. Verse 11. So the Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" And they're wondering why he's not here. He's been coming to most of the major feasts. He's been doing activity at the feast. So they're wondering, is he going to show up? Where is he at? Is Jesus here? They wanted to see him. They wanted to see his miracles. They wanted to hear him teach. They're looking for him. And verse 12 says, there was a great deal of talk about him in secret among the crowds. There's a lot of buzz about Jesus, and people are whispering and wondering, is he going to come? Where is he? Is he already here? And some were saying, he's a good man, verse 12. Others were saying, no, on the contrary, he's misleading the people. And the crowds are divided. They're not sure, and they don't all agree. Some think he's great. Some don't think he's so great. Some think he's really a good teacher. Some think he's misleading people. However, No one was speaking openly about him for fear of the Jews. And so you got a picture of the scene. All these people are coming to the feast. They're setting up their temporary booths in their little groups and their little parties. They're talking about Jesus. They're wondering if he's going to come. They're looking for him in the temple. And some are having one reaction, some are having another. But no one is actually talking about him publicly and openly because they're afraid of how the Jewish leadership might actually respond. But, verse 14, when it was now the middle of the feast, so we're 3 or 4 days into the festival, in the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple area and began to teach right there in the temple courts. And the Jews then were astonished, saying, how has this man become learned, not having been educated? And the idea isn't that he's ignorant, it's that he hasn't gone to official formal rabbi school. He's not a card carrying rabbi. He doesn't have a degree from the right, rabbi like Gamaliel or somebody else, right? He doesn't have that kind of education, yet you listen to him teach and he knows the scriptures so well and he's got so much insight and he asks so many good questions. And they're amazed and astonished at Jesus' grasp of the scriptures, even though he hasn't been trained by one of the recognized rabbis of the day. So, verse 16, Jesus answered them and said, my teaching is not my own, but his who sent me. This is his explanation for it. The things I teach, they come directly from God who sent me. If anyone is willing to do his will, if anyone is willing to do God's will, he will know about the teaching, whether it's of God or I'm speaking from myself. One of the things to pay attention to there in verses 16 and 17 is how those words counterbalance what Jesus said in John chapter 6 about the Father drawing or the Father granting people to believe in Jesus. Here it says, if anyone's willing to do God's will, he'll recognize Jesus' teaching as coming from God. Those two have to be put together. It's both and about those. You have to be taught of God. God's going to draw him, but you have to be willing, and you have to be willing to do God's will. And if you are, then you'll hear Jesus' teaching, you'll realize it's from God, and you'll let Jesus be your teacher, and you'll be taught of God. And then as Jesus continues in verse 18, he says, the one who speaks from himself seeks his own glory. So somebody who is merely offering his own thoughts, his own teaching, actually seeks his own honor. He seeks his own fame. But he who is seeking the glory of the one who sent him, he is true, and there's no unrighteousness in him. And what he says there in the second half of verse 18 is true as a general principle, and it's true particularly of Jesus himself. An ambassador or a representative who only says what the one who sent him wants him to say, and who only is seeking to honor the authority figure who sent him, well, then you can trust him because he's not out for what he can get himself. That's true as a general principle. And it's also true in particular about Jesus. Jesus has been sent by God. And he's not speaking merely for himself, and he's not seeking his own glory or his own honor. He's really only concerned about God's glory and God's honor, and that's why he's faithful and true. He's trustworthy as a representative of God. There's no unrighteousness in him. And so the contrast there in verse 18 is really between a spokesperson who speaks for his on his own initiative and for his own honor versus the faithful servant who simply carries out the will of the one who sent him and pursues his honor. And Jesus says he's in the latter category. He's a faithful spokesman of God himself, only caring about God's honor. Jesus goes on in verse 19 and says, did Moses not give you the law? And yet none of you carries out the law. Why are you seeking to kill me? Now, this is a very stinging rebuke that Jesus offers in the form of a question. Of course Moses gave the law, and for they themselves, most of those Jews there in Jerusalem for this Jewish feast, would have been observant of the law, so they would have claimed to carry out the law. And Jesus says, and yet none of you are carrying out the law. But the specific reason he gives, again, in the form of another question, why are you seeking to kill me? And that's really the point. Jesus contends that their intent to kill him is in violation of the law and evidences that you're not really ultimately interested in doing what the law says. Well, the crowd answered his question in verse 20 and said, "You have a demon. Who's seeking to kill you?" So apparently, there are some people there in the crowd who come to the defense of the Jewish leaders saying, "Who's trying to kill you?" Even though there are others who know that, no, they really are trying to kill him. And so, again, it's a mixed reaction from this crowd in a very tense, sort of hostile environment. Then Jesus actually recalls the miracle from chapter 5 that began and forced the hostility towards him, leading to the authorities' desire to kill him. So he's like, I'll tell you when this all started, and I'll give you evidence of who's trying to kill me. So he says in verse 21, I did one deed, and you all are astonished. The deed he's going to refer to is the healing of the lame man in chapter 5, the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. Jesus healed him on the Sabbath. They all acknowledged that he performed his great work of power, but they didn't therefore believe in him. They actually wanted to get rid of him because he was violating the Sabbath. So Jesus calls to mind this deed, and then Jesus makes an argument to show their inconsistency. So look what he says in verses 22 through 24. For this reason, Moses has given you circumcision. And then Jesus notes that technically it didn't come from Moses. It came from the patriarchs. It was being practiced during the days of Abraham. So he says, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. And even on the Sabbath, you circumcise a man. If a man can receive circumcision on a Sabbath so that the law of Moses will not be broken, are you angry at me because I made an entire man well on a Sabbath? Don't judge by outward appearance, but judge with righteous judgment. So here you can see that Jesus is calling to mind the healing of the lame man at the pool of Bethesda on the Sabbath from chapter 5. That's the deed he has in mind that have led the Jewish leaders to want to kill him. So he calls that event to mind, and then he makes a comparative argument between healing someone on the Sabbath and circumcising a baby boy on the Sabbath. He, in a nutshell, is saying, look, you're persecuting me because I healed a whole man on the Sabbath. That's what Jesus says. Yet you all sometimes, quote unquote, break the Sabbath by having to circumcise a baby boy on the Sabbath because it's the 8th day. So if it's permissible to circumcise on the Sabbath, and the rabbis by and large said it was, then if that's permissible, well, it's more permissible to heal a whole person on the Sabbath. And Jesus isn't really completely out of step with Jewish teaching here. Other rabbis had kind of taught something similar. There's times where we have to set aside this law in order to keep that law, one of which was circumcision. If a boy turns 8 days old on the Sabbath, guess what? We're going to have to perform circumcision on the Sabbath. It's going to take precedence in order to keep that law. And so Jesus is simply trying to get them to see how hypocritical they're being by trying to kill him, and he's using the healing of the lame man as evidence of that. Like, I healed a whole person on the Sabbath. Don't you think that's legitimate if circumcising someone's on the Sabbath is legitimate? And then John points out continued confusion and mixed response to who Jesus is. So look at verse 25. So some of the people of Jerusalem were saying, isn't this the man that they're seeking to kill? And yet look, he's speaking publicly, and they're saying nothing to him. The rulers don't really know that this is the Christ, do they? So they're like, I'm looking at the leaders, Jesus is teaching, and they're asking questions, and he's responding, but they're not doing anything. Do they know more than they're letting on? And then other people are like, yeah, but there's problems with his credentials as a Messiah. So look at verse 27. It says, however, we know where this man is from. But when the Christ comes, when Messiah comes, no one is going to know where he's from. This was sort of a traditional understanding of the Messiah, that he would appear and we wouldn't even really know where he's from. So some are like, but isn't that what's true about the Messiah? We're not going to know where he's from. And so they're confused. They're not sure. They don't know what to think about Jesus. This mixed reaction of the crowd. Jesus once again responds by affirming that he was sent to them by God. So look at verse 28. Then Jesus cried out in the temple, teaching and saying, you both know me and you know where I'm from. I have not come of myself, but he who sent me is true, whom you don't know. I do know him because I am from him and he sent me. And so Jesus affirms once again that he's been sent by God. And so, yes, they know where he's from, and yet they ultimately don't know where he's from because he's from God and they don't really know God. Because if they knew God, as Jesus has already taught, they would know Jesus. And once again, Jesus' affirmation of his identity as the Messiah sent from God leads to a reaction from the leaders where they want to do away with him. And so verse 30 simply summarizes that. So they were seeking to arrest him, and yet no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. And so we see here in verse 30 a echo of what was said at the very beginning, that his time hadn't come. His hour hadn't come. And somehow, as a result of that, even though they wanted to arrest him, they weren't able to do so, and Jesus escapes their grasp. So that's the first half of this story of what happens at the Feast of Tabernacles. We're going to leave it there for the sake of time. And in our next recording, we will pick up part 2 of Jesus and the Feast of Booths. So thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the New Testament. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by the generosity of dozens of people just like you. So to each and every one of you who gives, genuinely and sincerely, I say thanks a ton. God is using your generosity to make a huge difference in the lives of people all around the world. From the emails I get and the messages I get, I hear of the fruit that God is bearing through the Listener's Commentary, and that is because of your support, your prayers, your generosity. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you've been blessed or impacted by this ministry and want to join the team of supporters, you can go to listenerscommentary.com, click the Give button, and you can set up a one-time or recurring monthly donation right there. It goes through an organization called World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit. All those funds then will come to the ministry of the Listener's Commentary and my online ministry called Bible and Life. So thanks a ton for your support.